Late one night, while driving along a desolate stretch of highway that cut through miles of thick, tangled forest, Evelyn Thompson was fighting fatigue. The winding road ahead seemed endless, the headlights of her car barely piercing the oppressive darkness. It was supposed to be a quick trip home after a work conference in a nearby town, but the longer she drove, the more she regretted not waiting until morning. She hadn't seen another vehicle for hours, just the empty road stretching ahead, broken only by the occasional rustle of trees swaying in the wind. The GPS signal had cut out long ago, leaving her with nothing but the road signs to guide her. Her radio, too, had stopped picking up stations, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the unsettling sounds of the road. As she approached a narrow bridge that crossed over a deep ravine, something caught her eye. A figure standing on the side of the road, just beyond the bridge. Evelyn squinted, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was a woman, draped in a torn, pale dress, her face shadowed by the night. She was standing dangerously close to the edge, her body unnaturally still, as if frozen in place. Evelyn's heart raced as she debated what to do. She slowed her car, feeling a wave of dread creep over her. Something about the woman didn't seem right. Her posture, the way she seemed to be waiting. There was something off. But she couldn't just leave her there. What if she was hurt? Against her better judgment, Evelyn rolled her window down slightly as she pulled closer, the air cold and still. She called out, "Are you okay? Do you need help?" The woman didn't move. She just stared straight ahead, her eyes unfocused, almost as if she couldn't hear Evelyn at all. There was an eerie silence in the air, thick with tension, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Evelyn felt a shiver crawl down her spine. The road ahead was deserted, and her phone still had no signal. She glanced around, hoping for a passing car, a sign of life, anything, but there was nothing. She was alone with this strange woman, and something inside her screamed to drive away. Fast. Just as she was about to roll the window back up and leave, the woman's head jerked to the side with an unnatural speed, her eyes locking onto Evelyn's. There was something deeply wrong with her face. Her skin was too pale, almost gray, and her eyes were wide, glassy, reflecting the car's headlights with a hollow, lifeless gleam. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. Every instinct screamed for her to leave, but before she could react, the woman smiled. It was a twisted, horrifying smile, as though her face wasn't used to making the expression. The smile stretched too wide, showing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. Then, in a voice that was low and rasping, like it hadn't been used in years, the woman whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." Terror gripped Evelyn's chest. She slammed her foot on the gas, her car lurching forward as the woman's image blurred in her rearview mirror. She glanced back once, only to see the woman standing in the exact same spot, but now there were more figures, shadows, emerging from the trees, joining her on the side of the road. All of them were watching her. The car's engine roared as Evelyn sped across the bridge, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. The road seemed to stretch on forever, and no matter how fast she drove, it felt like the darkness was swallowing her whole. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with fear. Every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, she saw them, those figures growing in number, standing just beyond the reach of her taillights. The tension in the air was suffocating. The shadows seemed to multiply, spreading along the sides of the highway like a virus. Every so often, she caught glimpses of faces, blank, hollow, twisted, staring at her from the trees. Some were close, others further back, but all of them had the same unnatural, eerie stillness, and that same chilling smile. Hours seemed to pass, though it was likely only minutes, when Evelyn finally saw the glow of lights in the distance, a gas station. Relief washed over her, but it was tinged with the growing sense of dread that had gripped her since she first saw the woman. Still, she had to stop. She needed to get off this cursed highway. As she pulled into the gas station, it became clear how isolated the place was. There were no other cars, no attendants, just a dimly lit building with flickering neon signs. Her hands shook as she stepped out of the car, the cold air biting at her skin. She rushed inside, hoping for a sense of safety, but the store was eerily quiet, the shelves covered in a thin layer of dust, as if it hadn't seen customers in ages. She made her way to the counter, looking for someone, anyone. "Hello?" She called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the store's door creaked open behind her. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway was the woman from the side of the road. Her dress, now drenched in mud and torn even further, clung to her gaunt frame. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on Evelyn, and behind her, filling the entrance, were more figures, those shadowy, hollow-eyed people. Their faces were barely visible in the dim light, but she could feel their eyes on her, feel their presence pressing in. They didn't move, just stood there, blocking her only way out. The woman stepped forward, her smile widening once more. "You shouldn't have stopped," she whispered again, her voice even colder this time. Evelyn backed away, her body trembling, but she knew there was nowhere to go. Her heart raced as the figures stepped closer, surrounding her, trapping her in the small, empty store. The last thing Evelyn saw before everything went black was that same twisted smile, the woman's face inches from hers, whispering the words that echoed through her mind, "You should have kept driving." The sky was a dull, overcast gray as Jack Wilson drove down a long stretch of highway cutting through endless fields of corn. The day had started off fine. Blue skies, a steady breeze, but now the sun had sunk behind a thick blanket of clouds, casting everything in an eerie half-light. He had driven this road dozens of times, yet something about it today felt different. Off. The engine of his truck hummed steadily as he passed mile after mile of cornfields, the tall stalks swaying in the wind like silent sentinels. No other cars had passed in over an hour, and his phone had lost signal a while back. Jack adjusted in his seat, feeling the unsettling weight of isolation pressing in. As he drove, his headlights caught a glimpse of something. Movement just beyond the edge of the road. At first he thought it was an animal, a deer maybe, darting into the field. But when he looked again, there was nothing. Just the endless corn, rippling in the wind. He shook it off, trying to push down the growing unease that had been gnawing at him since he entered this part of the highway. A few minutes later, there it was again. This time, he was sure he saw something, a figure, standing between the rows of corn, watching the road. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He slowed the truck, scanning the fields, but again, there was nothing. Just an empty road stretching out in front of him and the wind rustling the stalks. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. His pulse quickened. Just as he was about to convince himself it was all in his head, his truck sputtered. The engine coughed and died, the headlights dimming to a faint glow before plunging the road into near-total darkness. Jack cursed under his breath and pulled to the side of the road, hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than he realized. The truck wasn't supposed to fail. He had it checked just last week. Jack turned the key in the ignition again, but the engine refused to catch. He tried a few more times, but nothing worked. Frustrated, he slammed his hands on the dashboard. The wind outside picked up, making the corn whisper and hiss like voices in the dark. Jack glanced around nervously, the silence of the highway now suffocating. He knew he hadn't seen a gas station or house for miles. Reluctantly, he stepped out of the truck and grabbed a flashlight from the glove box. The beam cut through the dim twilight, but only barely. He aimed it at the truck's engine, pretending he knew what he was looking for. But deep down, he felt the gnawing presence of eyes on him, watching from somewhere in the corn. Suddenly, there was movement again. This time, it wasn't subtle. Jack heard the distinct sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the field. His blood ran cold. He whipped the flashlight toward the corn, the beam catching nothing but waving stalks. But the footsteps continued, getting closer. "Hello?" Jack called, his voice louder than intended. There was no reply, just the rhythmic sound of someone or something pacing along the edge of the road. The footsteps stopped. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen, staring into the rows of corn. The wind died down, leaving an unsettling silence, broken only by the faint creak of swaying stalks. Then, from deep within the field, he heard a voice. A whisper, low, raspy, almost inhuman. It called his name. Jack. His mouth went dry. He hadn't told anyone he was driving this way. No one knew. So who could possibly be calling him? "Jack, come here." The voice was closer now, just beyond the edge of the corn. The flashlight trembled in his hand as Jack took a step back, the primal instinct to run kicking in. But before he could move, the stalks parted and a figure stepped out onto the road. It was a man, tall, gaunt, and dressed in old weathered clothes, as if he'd been wandering the fields for years. His face was pale, sunken, with dark shadows under his eyes. And his smile, God, that smile, was all wrong. It stretched too wide, like his skin was barely holding his face together. "Car trouble?" the man asked, his voice a sickly rasp. His eyes were hollow, almost empty, but they gleamed with something unnatural, something predatory. Jack took another step back, his stomach twisting in knots. Yeah. It just died on me," he stammered, trying to sound casual, though every nerve in his body was screaming to get away. The man's smile widened further, impossibly wide now, the skin around his mouth cracking. "You should have kept driving," he said softly. Before Jack could respond, the man lunged. Jack barely had time to react, the flashlight slipping from his hand as he stumbled backward. The man's fingers grazed his shirt, but Jack twisted away, scrambling to his feet. His heart raced, adrenaline surging as he bolted toward the truck, throwing open the door and slamming it shut behind him. Panting, Jack locked the doors and fumbled with the keys, trying the ignition again. It sputtered, coughed, but still refused to start. Outside, the man stood in the middle of the road, watching him with that grotesque smile, his head tilted to the side. Then, without warning, more figures emerged from the corn. Dozens of them, all with the same hollow eyes and twisted smiles. They moved slowly, deliberately, surrounding the truck, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of the flashlight lying on the ground. Jack's pulse hammered in his ears as he tried the engine again, desperate for it to turn over. The figures pressed closer, their hands touching the truck, fingernails scraping against the windows. Jack could feel the panic rising in his throat. He slammed the key forward one more time, and with a roar, the engine came to life. Without a second thought, he floored the gas, the truck lurching forward, tires screeching as it tore down the highway. In the rearview mirror, Jack watched as the figures stood in the road, still watching him, their twisted smiles fading into the distance. He didn't stop, not once. He kept driving, even when his phone regained signal and the faint lights of a town appeared on the horizon. The image of those hollow-eyed people haunted him for the rest of his life. And no matter how hard he tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the light, a bad dream, one thing remained clear in his mind: he never should have stopped. It was a moonless night when Laura Dawson found herself driving alone on a backcountry highway, the kind of road that felt as if it had been forgotten by time. Tall, skeletal trees lined both sides of the road, their barren branches reaching out like twisted fingers, casting strange, spidery shadows across the cracked asphalt. Laura was exhausted, but the thought of staying in the tiny, rundown motel she'd passed earlier made her skin crawl. She figured it would be safer to keep going, even if the GPS had led her down this eerie, desolate stretch of road. Her old sedan hummed steadily beneath her, the rhythmic thrum of the tires on the pavement, the only sound in the vast silence. There wasn't another car in sight, and the isolation began to weigh on her, making the darkness seem even more oppressive. As she rounded a bend, her headlights illuminated something on the side of the road. A man. He was standing still, almost too still, just at the edge of the trees, his back to her. His clothes were tattered, hanging loosely off his tall, thin frame, and he didn't seem to move at all, not even when her headlights washed over him. Laura's heart skipped a beat, but she told herself it was nothing. Just some drifter, or maybe a hiker who got lost. She kept driving, glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping she wouldn't see him again. But as the glow of her taillights disappeared, the man didn't seem to react, didn't turn or make any movement at all. She shook her head, trying to shake off the chill that had settled into her bones. But only a few miles later, her headlights caught something again. Another figure, standing at the side of the road just ahead. This time, it was a woman. She was barefoot, her feet dirty, and her hair hanging in stringy, tangled clumps. Her face was hidden by the shadow of her hair, and like the man, she stood perfectly still, facing away from the road. Laura's grip tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. A wave of dread rolled over her, and she couldn't explain why. There was something deeply unsettling about how still they were, how they both faced away from the road as if they were waiting for something. Trying to calm her nerves, she pressed the gas a little harder, her car speeding up as she passed the woman. But the image of her lingering just outside the reach of the headlights clung to Laura's mind. She checked her rearview mirror again. Nothing. The road behind her was empty, swallowed by darkness. Her phone's GPS blinked out suddenly, the screen flickering to black. The radio, which had been softly playing static for miles, went silent too. Laura's stomach twisted. She was in the middle of nowhere, without a signal, without any sense of where she was going. And then, her car's engine sputtered. No, 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 Laura muttered, her heart pounding in her chest. She pressed the gas pedal, but the car slowed to a crawl. The dashboard lights flickered, and with one final jolt, the car coasted to a stop, dead in the middle of the road. She sat in stunned silence, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the eerie silence that filled the space around her. Not even the wind stirred. She reached for her phone, hoping to at least call for help, but there was no signal. The screen was as black as the night around her. Panic began to bubble up in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. Maybe she could flag down a passing car. Someone had to come by eventually. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing. But then she heard it. A faint sound like the shuffling of feet coming from somewhere behind her. Laura's eyes snapped open. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her blood running cold. There, standing in the middle of the road, was the woman she had passed earlier. Only now, she was facing her. The woman's face was pale, almost chalk white, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth was twisted into a strange, crooked smile, as though it had been stretched too far. She stood motionless, just like before, but something was different now. Laura could feel it, a malevolent presence radiating from her. And behind her, stepping out from the darkness, were more figures. Men, women, all with the same hollow eyes and sickening smiles, their bodies moving in stiff, jerky motions as they approached the car. Laura's heart raced. She fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the car, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold on to them. The engine sputtered, but it wouldn't catch. She tried again, harder this time, her pulse pounding in her ears. Outside, the figures came closer, their movements slow but deliberate. There were at least 10 of them now, stepping out from the trees surrounding the car. Their lifeless eyes never left her, and that sickening smile never faltered. It stretched wider, grotesquely wide, until their faces looked like they were splitting apart. Laura's breath came in shallow gasps as she yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The figures were closer now, their hands brushing against the car, leaving streaks of dirt on the windows. She locked eyes with the woman standing at the front of the group. That smile. It was as though it was mocking her, feeding off her terror. Suddenly, a soft thud echoed from the roof of the car. Laura froze, her body going rigid with fear. Another thud, and then slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the top of the car. Something or someone was up there. Her mind raced, every instinct screaming at her to move, to do something, but her body felt paralyzed with fear. The figures outside pressed closer, their faces nearly touching the glass, their hands smearing across the windows. They began tapping, lightly at first, then harder, like they were testing the glass, seeing how much it would take before it broke. The footsteps on the roof stopped directly above her, and then, without warning, a face slammed against the driver's side window. A man's face, his eyes wide and bloodshot, his mouth twisted into that same horrific smile. His breath fogged up the glass as he leaned in closer, his voice a low, rasping whisper. "Let us in." The windows cracked. With a scream, Laura threw herself against the passenger door, flinging it open and tumbling out onto the cold asphalt. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She just ran, sprinting down the road, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath ragged. The tapping, the whispers, the figures, they all seemed to follow her, the sound of their laughter echoing in her ears. As she ran, the darkness seemed to stretch on forever, and the figures were always just behind her, no matter how far she went. She didn't stop running, not until she saw the faint glow of headlights in the distance, but by then it was too late. The rain came down in sheets as Mark Hastings drove along the winding mountain highway, his wipers working overtime to keep the windshield clear. He squinted through the downpour, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the storm raged around him. The road was treacherous, slick with rainwater, and every turn seemed sharper than the last. He was tired, having driven for hours, but he couldn't stop now, not on this road, not in this weather. His destination was a remote cabin, like a getaway he had rented for the weekend. A few days of solitude, peace, and quiet away from the grind of his daily life. But as the night wore on and the storm worsened, the isolation began to feel more like a threat than a retreat. The GPS had lost signal hours ago, leaving him relying on memory and a hastily scribbled map on a piece of paper that now lay crumpled on the passenger seat. His headlights barely penetrated the darkness, and the only sign of civilization was the occasional weather-beaten road sign pointing to small towns that seemed impossibly far away. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour, just the relentless rain and the endless winding road. As he rounded another sharp curve, his headlights caught something in the distance. At first, it was just a dark shape in the middle of the road, barely visible through the rain. Mark slowed down, his heart skipping a beat. It was a car, an old sedan sitting still, its hazard lights flickering weakly. Mark pulled up beside it and rolled down his window, the rain instantly drenching his arm. "Hey, you need help?" he called out, but there was no response. The car looked abandoned, the windows fogged up, and the interior dark. He frowned, glancing at the road ahead. There was no sign of anyone around. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the storm, and Mark jumped, his pulse quickening. He looked around, but saw nothing, just the downpour and the shadowy trees looming on either side of the road. Something felt wrong. Every instinct told him to keep driving, to get as far away from this place as possible. But then, as he shifted his car back into gear, he saw it. Movement. A figure emerging from the trees just ahead. It was a woman, her clothes soaked and clinging to her as she stumbled toward the road, waving her arms desperately. "Help, please," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the sound of the storm. Mark hesitated for a moment, the creeping sense of dread crawling up his spine. But he couldn't just leave her out here in the rain. He pulled the car closer, rolling down the window again. "Get in! Hurry!" The woman rushed toward the car, throwing open the passenger door and collapsing into the seat, gasping for breath. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her skin was pale, her eyes wide with fear. "Thank you. Thank you so much," she panted, her voice trembling. I didn't think anyone would come." Mark glanced at her, feeling uneasy. "What happened? Is that your car back there?" She nodded, shivering. "Yeah, it broke down a while ago, and I've been walking, trying to find help." "How long have you been out here?" he asked, pulling back onto the road. "I don't know. A few hours, maybe. I got lost. There's something out here," she whispered, her voice barely above a murmur. "Something in the woods." Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "What do you mean? Like an animal?" The woman shook her head, her eyes darting nervously toward the window. "No, not an animal. It's something else. I saw it. I heard it. It's been following me. I don't know what it is, but it's not human." Mark swallowed hard, his heart racing. He wanted to dismiss it as paranoia, fear brought on by being alone in the woods during a storm. But there was something about the way she said it, the terror in her eyes, that made him uneasy. As they drove in silence, the rain pounding against the car, Mark glanced over at her again. She was staring out the window, her body tense, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The road twisted and turned through the dense forest, and with every bend, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. He couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, moving through the trees, keeping pace with them. Suddenly, the woman gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "There! Do you see it?" she cried, pointing out the window. Mark jerked his head to look, his stomach lurching with fear. For a moment, he saw nothing but darkness and rain. But then, between the trees, he caught a glimpse of movement. A tall, shadowy figure, impossibly fast, darting between the trees. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his blood running cold. He pressed the gas pedal harder, the car speeding up as they navigated the winding road. "It's getting closer," the woman whispered, her voice shaking. "It's always getting closer." Mark didn't respond. He was too focused on the road, his heart pounding in his chest. The headlights illuminated the narrow, twisting path ahead, but the shadows between the trees seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. Every time he glanced out the window, he swore he saw movement, something large and fast following them, keeping just out of sight. Then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered. "No, no, no," Mark muttered, pressing the gas harder. The car lurched forward, but the engine coughed again, losing power. The headlights flickered and the car began to slow down. "We can't stop," the woman whispered, her voice tight with fear. It's coming. It'll catch us if we stop. Mark's hands trembled as he tried to restart the car, but the engine refused to turn over. The headlights flickered again, casting strange, dancing shadows across the trees. And then the car died completely, plunging them into darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of the rain, the steady rhythm of it hitting the roof of the car. Then, slowly through the downpour, Mark heard something else, something that made his blood run cold. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, squelching through the mud and leaves, moving toward the car. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he glanced at the woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't speak, didn't move, just stared out the window, her body frozen in fear. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Mark's heart raced, his mind screaming for him to do something, anything. He reached for his phone, but there was no signal, just the dead screen staring back at him. The footsteps stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then something slammed against the back of the car. The impact jolted them both forward in their seats. And Mark's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. He glanced in the rearview mirror, but all he could see was darkness. Suddenly the woman screamed, her voice piercing the silence. "It's here! It's here!" Mark's heart pounded as he looked out the window, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing just outside the car, was a figure, tall, gaunt, with long, twisted limbs. Its face was a grotesque mask of pale skin and black, hollow eyes that seemed to bore into his soul. It smiled. Without thinking, Mark grabbed the door handle and flung the door open. "Run!" he shouted, pulling the woman with him as they stumbled out into the rain. They ran, their feet slipping on the wet ground, the storm roaring around them. Mark didn't dare look back. He could hear the thing behind them, its heavy footsteps splashing through the mud, gaining on them with every step. The trees loomed closer, the shadows darker, and the sound of the footsteps filled the air, deafening in the storm. But no matter how fast they ran, the footsteps never stopped. They were always just behind them, and they were getting closer. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky as Claire Hart navigated the lonely highway through the desert. It was the kind of night that seemed to swallow everything in its path. The stars barely visible, the road stretching out into the darkness like a forgotten ribbon. The clock on her dashboard read just past midnight, and the air around her felt unnaturally still. She hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the isolation was beginning to weigh on her. She was on her way to a friend's wedding in a small town hours away, a road trip she had looked forward to at first. But now, the long stretches of barren landscape and the dark, empty road were starting to feel oppressive. The static from the radio was the only sound breaking the silence, but even that was more unsettling than comforting. Claire squinted in the distance, her headlights struggling to cut through the darkness. A part of her mind nagged her to pull over and rest, but the other part, the part that didn't want to be stranded alone in the middle of nowhere, kept her foot on the gas. As she rounded a curve, something caught her eye. At the side of the road just ahead, a figure was standing in the shadows, barely illuminated by her headlights. Claire's breath hitched. A man, tall and gaunt, was facing the road, dressed in what looked like a tattered old coat. His posture was rigid, unnatural, his head slightly tilted down as if he was looking at something on the ground. Claire's heart began to pound in her chest. She slowed the car instinctively, peering at him as she passed. For a moment, she considered stopping to ask if he needed help, but a deep sense of unease took hold of her. Something about the man felt wrong. His stillness, the way he stood in the middle of nowhere, not even looking up as her car approached. As she drove by, she couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. The man was still there, standing in the exact same spot, motionless. Claire shuddered and pressed the gas a little harder, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Several miles passed, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Her mind replayed the image of the man, standing there, doing nothing. She tried to brush it off as her nerves getting the best of her, but the feeling lingered. Just as she was about to let out a breath, her car's headlights caught another figure on the side of the road, another man. This one was closer to the road, and this time he was facing her car. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, and as she sped past, his lips curled into a thin, unnatural smile. Claire's pulse quickened. She stared straight ahead, refusing to look back this time. What the hell was going on? It couldn't be the same man. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of her without her seeing. But the resemblance was too close. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but the unsettling dread gnawing at her insides refused to let her think straight. Suddenly, the car's dashboard lights flickered. "No, no, no," Claire muttered, her heart sinking. The car jolted, the engine sputtering before stalling completely. The headlights dimmed until they barely illuminated the road ahead, and Claire coasted to a stop in the middle of the highway. Her fingers shook as she fumbled for her phone, but when she looked at the screen, her stomach dropped. No signal. Of course. She was stranded, alone, on a dark highway in the middle of the desert. A tap. It was faint, barely audible over the sound of her shallow breathing, but Claire heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the passenger side window. Her heart hammered in her chest as she slowly turned her head, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. There, standing just outside her car, was the man. The same man she had seen earlier. His face was pressed against the window, that same twisted smile stretching unnaturally across his gaunt features. His breath fogged the glass as his hollow eyes stared into hers, unblinking, as though he could see right through her. Claire let out a strangled gasp and lunged for the lock, her fingers trembling as she fumbled to secure the doors. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as the man's smile widened. His fingers scraped against the glass now, slow and deliberate, like he was testing the strength of the window. "Go away," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for the engine to come back to life, for anything to happen that could get her out of this nightmare. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the tapping stopped. Claire opened her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. The man was gone. Her heart pounded in her ears as she scanned the area around the car, but there was no sign of him. The road was empty, and the oppressive silence had returned, but the dread didn't leave her. If anything, it was worse now. Without warning, something slammed against the back of the car. The entire vehicle jolted, and Claire screamed, whipping around in her seat. Her rear windshield was fogged up, but through the haze, she could see movement. Something was crawling on top of the car. Another slam, this time from the roof. Claire's heart raced, and she scrambled to restart the engine, her hands shaking violently. The dashboard lights flickered again, and the engine sputtered to life. Without thinking, she floored the gas, the car lurching forward as the thing on the roof clung on, its weight shifting above her. Claire's pulse raced as she sped down the highway, the sound of scraping metal filling her ears as the figure on the roof dragged its fingers along the sides of the car. She didn't dare look up, her vision focused solely on the road ahead. All she wanted was to get away from this nightmare, to escape whatever had latched onto her. But no matter how fast she drove, the weight on the roof didn't shift, the scratching didn't stop. And then, as she rounded another bend, the sound stopped. The weight lifted. Claire glanced in the rearview mirror, her breath catching in her throat. The road behind her was empty, as if the thing that had been on top of her car had simply vanished into thin air. The only sound now was the steady hum of the engine and the rain that had begun to patter lightly against the windshield. But the relief didn't last long. Up ahead, standing in the middle of the road, was the man. His twisted smile was wider than ever, and this time there was nowhere for Claire to go.